we are going to wait a couple of minutes so that everybody who has a chance to watch it live will be able to be here before we get officially started. So hello, everyone. I'm excited for today's talk. We're just going to wait a couple minutes before we get started to let everybody arrive. So feel free to say hello in the chat. Let me double check that the chat is on. It should be. Hello, everybody. Hello in Oman. Oh, that's far away. Hello. Hello, Max and Amy. Hi, everybody. Hello in Chicago and Iowa and New York. Hello in Boston. I hope that anybody who is in the areas impacted by the hurricane are okay. You've all been in my thoughts today. I know one of our regular authors published instructors has a power outage right now, so I hope that those of you in Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas are able to watch, but if not, we will be recording this. I know that a lot of people are without power today. So hello, everybody, and welcome. We're just going to take a couple minutes so that everyone can show up before we get started. And yeah, welcome. Feel free to say hello in the chat. Hello in Toronto. I'm in Toronto as well. Hello in California. Hello in North Central Florida. I'm glad that you are here and safe. Hello in Texas and Albuquerque. Hello, everybody. Hello in Vancouver and California, and hello, everybody. So thank you for being here. All right, so let's get started. Let me pull up my notes. Hello, writers. This is Jacob Jans with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Before we officially launch into today's talk, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about Truth and Reconciliation Day, which is happening here in Canada on Monday. The day exists in part because of the many children who were forced from their homes and sent to residential schools where they were not allowed to speak to their families, speak their languages, and suffered many abuses. Many children did not survive. The last school in Canada closed in the 90s. I'm an American living in Canada, and I know this is something that happened in both countries. The last residential school in the US, I believe, closed in 2007. It's important to remember, too, that the residential schools were just one part of a larger system of oppression. And even though the schools have closed, many similar problems are still ongoing. Reconciliation is in part about moving forward and healing. There isn't an easy way to do that or just one way to do that, but I do have one recommendation, which is to read the book, The Power of Story by Indigenous author Harold Johnson, which is about the stories we share as a society and how they shape us and the world we live in. It's both moving and enlightening, and a book I very much recommend reading. Someone I know recently read this book and then read it again 3 times. So if that's not a good endorsement, I don't know what is. So this is a book that I really think is well worth your time. So today, moving on, today I'm pleased to introduce Lee Taylor Johnson, who will be giving a talk on writing the second act of your story so you can propel readers into the final act of your story. So Lee is a fiction editor, a novel writing coach, a regular contributor to Authors Publish magazine, as well as the author of the book, How to Write a Dynamic Act 1, a guide for novelists. I'm also happy to say that we're publishing a follow-up book by Lee very soon on the same topic as this talk, writing a second act to your story. So Lee is also a member of the Northwest Editors Guild and the Editorial Freelancers Association. For those interested in working with Lee, I encourage you to visit their website. We'll share a link with that when we send out recording. So thank you, Lee, for being here, and welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. And I'm really excited to hear your presentation today and learn more about writing the second act to a story, which I think is a topic that's often neglected. There is a lot of information out there about writing a strong beginning and a strong end, but like the middle, I mean, personally as a reader, that's the meat of the story, right? So that's something that's actually really important.
I think it's one of the parts that gets ignored in a lot of writing advice because everyone sort of assumes that you have your own plan for the story and that you know which way you're going to go with it, but it still helps to have like those building blocks in place, so you know how to take that idea and turn it into something that is going to be functional for the whole manuscript.
Hmm. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So you can go ahead and pull up your slides.
Yeah, absolutely.
And everyone here, keep in mind, we will be sending out the slides with the recording. And you can also ask questions at the end of the talk.
All right. Is that showing up?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. Today, we are going to be talking about writing the essential scenes of Act Two. So we will tackle this. Sorry, let me just move this window really quick. Sorry about that. We'll tackle this by answering three main questions here. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is not wanting to, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay. We'll cover three main questions. Firstly, what are these essential scenes? We'll discuss exactly what makes a scene essential based on how it fits into the structure of Act Two and your story as a whole, as well as the purpose it serves within your second act. We'll cover what makes them work. These are the details you need to include in these scenes in order to help them fulfill that purpose. And finally, what questions should they answer? This is similar to the previous question, but it focuses a little more on reader experience, going beyond the checklist of must-haves for the scene, and instead getting into the information you'll want to address to ensure these scenes are clear and believable, and that readers can pick up on the story you're trying to tell. With that in mind, what are essential scenes? Simply put, they are key beats that define your story's overall plot. These are the scenes you need to keep you in line, not only with the type of story you're telling, whether that's a romance, a tragedy, the archetypal hero's journey, or whatever, but with the story that you are telling, which are the ideas and features that make it unique to other stories that may be following a similar path or structure. So speaking of structure, one of the things that defines a scene as essential is that essential scenes uphold the narrative structure of your story. They make sure that important moments happen at pivotal times in order to maintain your pacing and tension. So over here, you can see we have a visual of the typical three-act narrative structure, starting with the opening scenes in Act One and ending with the resolution in Act Three. Imagine that the green line here is your story's path through the acts, with the tension and stakes rising and falling throughout. As you can see from this diagram, most essential scenes take place at the peaks and troughs of this line, where stakes and tension are at their highest or their lowest. There are also essential scenes on these divider points, the little dotted lines that help to transition between each of the acts. So if you look in the middle at Act Two in particular, we can identify at least four essential scenes, which are the ones marked by the stars and the transition between Act Two and Three. I will admit this is a little bit deceptive because the graphic only includes scenes that are most crucial to the three-act structure and doesn't get into things like character arc and subplots, which will also be essential depending on how you incorporate them. So we today will be talking about 5 essential scenes, but this is a really good jumping off point for a general idea of your story. So before we get into the breakdowns of each of these scenes, we're going to look at them in action in the 2004 movie Mean Girls, which I love. It was a staple of my teenage years. Admittedly, this is not a book, but it works as a very good example because each scene is very clearly defined and has a visible impact on the course of the plot. So for now, I will briefly describe each essential scene in Act 2 to show what they're accomplishing and how they fit into that narrative structure. But we'll return to these examples later when we start talking about these essential scenes in detail and how and why they work. So our first scene takes place just after the inciting event, after Katie on the left here has agreed to join the Plastics, a clique of mean popular girls at her new public high school, in order to spy on them for her friends Janice and Damien. From her very first hangout with the Plastics, Katie begins learning the rules of what she calls girl world through the lens of their clique, which is who to talk to, how to talk about them, and even what clothes to wear, as evidenced by this scene where they're all wearing pink because it's Wednesday. And over the next few scenes, she learns about the burn book. She gets her words turned against her in the four-way phone call and is generally just witness to the cruelty the Plastics enact on girls that break or otherwise ignore the rules of girl world. Then comes the Halloween party. Katie has developed a crush on her classmate Erin, shown here, and has told Regina about it. And unbeknownst to her, this violates the rules of girl world because Erin is Regina's ex. Regina punishes this by bad-mouthing Katie at the party and getting back together with Erin, going so far as to kiss him after making sure that she's watching. Katie is horrified and betrayed and vows revenge on Regina. Following the party, Katie continues to spend time with the Plastics, pretending that everything's fine while using the rules of girl world to subtly sabotage Regina and her relationship with Erin. She conducts her own phone call ambushes, as shown here, manipulates the other girls into spilling secrets, and gives Regina fake diet tips before the upcoming school dance. In her own words, she becomes completely obsessed with Regina and taking her down. When Regina eventually learns of this betrayal, she retaliates by printing out the burn book and implicating all of the other girls in the creation of the rumors held inside of it. This results in a school-wide fight that prompts an assembly in which all of the girls are lectured about the damage rumors can do and are forced to publicly apologize. Katie, at this point, is unwilling to confront her behavior and avoids apologizing until Janice outs their original plan to infiltrate the Plastics, which exposes Katie as having been fake from the very beginning. Regina confronts Katie, condemning her for acting like she's innocent and above it all, and is hit by a bus in the middle of their argument. Overcome with shame and finally realizing the scope of the impact her actions have had, Katie resolves to be a better person and accepts full blame for the burn book, sacrificing her reputation at a chance for redemption. So here is a quick look at how all of those scenes fit into the Act 2 structure we were looking at from before. And you can kind of see here how the story starts to unfold just from these key scenes in Act 2. Katie gets introduced into girl world and internalizes its lessons in an attempt to fit in, experiences a betrayal that twists her motivations and slowly corrupts her in the second half, then is forced to reckon with her flaws and make amends going into the climax. So with all of this in mind, let's get into the actual breakdowns of each essential scene and discuss what you can do to make them work for your story. First up is the new world. This is where, like Jacob said earlier, the meat of your story actually begins. This is after you've handled all of the setup in Act 1. So the first thing the new world accomplishes is it sets up your new setting and status quo. With the inciting event out of the way, your protagonist has a new goal to pursue, a new routine, and in some cases, new surroundings. This is where you will start ramping up your tension and stakes. The protagonist is an outsider or is otherwise unfamiliar with this new world, so they're likely to make mistakes in pursuing their new goal. These mistakes lay the groundwork for future conflicts, establishing stakes and building tension by introducing new obstacles. A great way to do this is by using complications, which are small conflicts that the protagonist encounters along the way that slowly compound on each other to create bigger and more pressing problems. In short, the purpose of the new world is to set up your story and build tension with early plot points and establishing details. To do this, you can establish a pressing external conflict at the first pinch point. Give the protagonist an obstacle that stands in the way of immediately achieving their goal and make it clear why it can't be allowed to continue standing in their way. From there, you can break the protagonist's goal into smaller, actionable steps. This ensures your protagonist isn't just running headlong into a major obstacle without any preparation, and kind of keeps your story flowing at a more natural pace. It also gives you some opportunities to add in some more world building and characterization and to start introducing things like subplots and other arcs that you want to include in the overall second act. Finally, maintain a clear chain of cause and effect. You don't want your story to be made up of a bunch of episodic obstacles and accomplishments, and you want that connective tissue that will make it flow well. This ties in with the complications I mentioned in the previous slide. So just consider how each decision the protagonist makes in the face of one obstacle affects the next, and so on. This keeps your protagonist acting and reacting and makes sure that they have agency, which is going to be incredibly important in keeping them important to the story rather than having the story happen to them. Just to quickly add, you might be thinking that this is a lot to accomplish in a single scene, and you are absolutely correct. Act 2 is absolutely a beast, and you're often going to need several scenes to really convey all of the information you need to set up the next plot point properly. So if it's more helpful to think of these as essential sequences rather than essential scenes, I strongly encourage you to do so. When it comes to identifying your pinch points, just try to determine which of those scenes introduces the most information or kicks off that chain of cause and effect most effectively, and then use that to build off of as you continue your sequence. So let's go into some guiding questions. These are designed to help you plan out this scene or scenes and make sure you're including all the key info you need. We'll have guiding questions for each of the different scenes here. So starting off, what is your protagonist's new goal? What are they trying to accomplish? What kind of challenges do they encounter in pursuing it? In other words, what gets in their way? And finally, what kind of complications arise from their approach to these challenges? This is, again, that chain of cause and effect. How are they complicit in the way the plot is evolving? So to return to our Mean Girls example, this is how the New World scene here answers those questions. What is the protagonist's new goal? Her goal is to infiltrate the plastics. The challenges she encounters: Katie has been homeschooled her entire life and therefore doesn't understand the emotional nuances of adolescence, especially adolescent girlhood and popularity. She's an outsider and wants to learn how this new environment works. And what kind of complications arise from her approach to these challenges? Katie has internalized the fact that she's an outsider. She assumes she's exempt from the rules of girl world and that she's just an observer who's trying to fit in rather than someone who has power over her situation. She's naive, which is her fatal flaw and will end up being a very big deal starting right now. So the midpoint is where this fatal flaw really first comes into play. This scene is all about creating a high tension, high stakes scenario in which everything that happens in the first half of the book comes to a head, resulting in an upset where the protagonist's fatal flaw is on display. If you're familiar with the save the cat method at all, this is also known as the false victory or defeat. It also marks a tonal shift in the story, meaning that while the literal plot doesn't change too much, there's a twist in the atmosphere or the protagonist's motivations, which we will talk about more in the next scene. But for now, all of this is to say that the midpoint provides catharsis for the tension built up in the first half of the story. And to achieve this, you can create a false victory or defeat that complicates but does not significantly change the stakes. The protagonist's end goal remains more or less the same, but something has happened to make achieving that goal more complicated or difficult. A good way to do this is by resolving the first external conflict. Whatever their goal might be, this is a good time to remove the first big problem that's getting in their way. And by taking care of that pressing issue, you pave the way for a new complication to take its place and kind of replace the external conflict and have something new to rally against. And finally, make sure your protagonist's fatal flaw is on display and either directly or indirectly responsible for the midpoint victory or defeat. Something worth noting here is that you should try to accomplish this within a single scene. This is one of the essential scenes that takes place at the peak of that tension and stakes line. So you want to try to keep this short in order to keep your pacing kind of moving forward. Don't try to linger too much on the halfway point. So with that in mind, let's get into our guiding questions. What major event alters the status quo? What old problem is resolved and what new problem awaits? And how is it the protagonist's fault? What actions of theirs allowed for this to happen? So this is our Halloween party moment. The major event that alters the status quo is Regina getting back together with Aaron, which betrays Katie's trust. And while it's not Katie's fault exactly, her naivete is still somewhat responsible for this. because she thinks of herself as an outsider to girl world and she thinks she's in with the plastics. She assumes things are going to be different and that Regina is not going to target and hurt her the way that she has targeted and hurt everybody else. She has specifically ignored the direct warning she's received from Janice about Regina being a mean girl, and even Regina's own admission that she hurt Janice's feelings back when they were supposedly friends. And then Katie gets burned. As a bonus, this also marks the resolution of their first external conflict, which was Katie feeling like she didn't understand the rules of girl world. She has now fallen victim to them, and in her quest for revenge, she has a new external conflict, which is Regina herself. So that brings us to the new world Twisted. Like I mentioned before, your main plot, setting, and routine don't change too much here. It's just that something is a little different. It's in the title, it's still the new world, it's just a little bit twisted. So this sequence introduces the new status quo. It highlights the specific ways that the old status quo has changed in the wake of this twist. Now is the time that you can establish what is different and what's not, and why those specific changes that you're introducing are important. Why does it matter that these things are different instead of these? Keep in mind that overall this should be relatively low tension. Readers have just finished a very high tension point with the midpoint, and this is a very good time to give them a break to just process and observe and try to get a little bit more of a handle on where the story is going. You don't want to just keep ramping things up and constantly be upping the stakes, even in genres where that's typically what you want to do is like high tension all the time. You still need these breaks to let readers breathe, let the characters process so that they can progress through their character arc. So that is why here you want to focus most of your attention on the protagonist's development to show how they specifically are being affected by the events of the midpoint and how their world has changed in the aftermath. So in short, show how the new world has become corrupted. To do this, split your focus between the external and internal conflicts. Keep the new external conflict at the forefront, but take some time to show how it's affecting the protagonist and their personal journey. Offer a break in tension using fewer action sequences. If your plot is one that typically relies on a lot of action, at least try to stick with familiar actions, things that you've already introduced to the story before. If you're someone who does, like superhero fiction or something, if you have training sequences or whatever, keep those going without introducing new kinds of action, because that is a new source of stress. It's a new source of tension, new source of information. Stick with what's familiar. And finally, set up the protagonist's upcoming breaking point by continually highlighting their fatal flaw through these scenes. This brings us to our guiding questions. So how has the protagonist's goal changed or become more complicated? In keeping with the title of this sequence, what has twisted? How has their approach changed as a result? How are they twisted? And why is it still doomed to fail? Whatever this new approach may be, how are they basically just doubling down on their fatal flaw rather than resolving it? In the Mean Girls example, the new world Twisted follows Katie's descent into becoming a full plastic. While she was originally just spending time with the plastics to playfully infiltrate and mock them, she is now laser focused on sabotaging Regina and her relationship with Aaron so that Katie can win him back. Her goal is still more or less the same, but it's become more complicated because she's more focused on Regina. Her approach has changed because Katie now thinks she understands girl world and is actively using these rules to her advantage instead of acting as a bystander. And why is it still doomed to fail? Katie's fatal flaw is still her naivete. She still thinks she's an outsider that is exempt from the rules, which makes her believe that she can't do any real harm in her quest to take down Regina. She considers herself innocent because she thinks Regina deserves it and doesn't ever stop to consider that that's flawed logic or how she might be hurting other people in the process. That brings us to mistakes and consequences. This scene establishes your story's rock bottom, the point where the protagonist is at their lowest and makes a mistake that seems impossible to take back as a direct result of their fatal flaw. This mistake and the resulting fallout forces them to confront their internal conflict, acknowledging not only their responsibility for that mistake, but also how and why they made it. They face their fatal flaw head on and realize oh no, their biggest obstacle to happiness has been themselves all along. Who could have seen it coming? You, the writer, did. This moment acts as the climax of their character arc, and it's important to note here that this happens before the climax of the story. We won't dive too far into that right now because that's stuff for Act 3. But basically, you want the major elements of the protagonist's character arc to be handled before you get to the climax of the story. That way, they're fully equipped to take it on and be ready for that. The climax itself will give them a chance to prove that they've learned their lesson and that it's sticking with them. But right now is about actually learning that lesson so they can put it into action later. So the most effective way to have them confront that fatal flaw is to make it the worst it's ever been. Force them to make a mistake directly because of their flaw and make it undeniably their fault. The events of the midpoint, because there's so many external things happening, should give them a little bit of plausible deniability. They can pretend it wasn't their fault or that they weren't responsible somehow. In this situation, there should be no question, 100% undeniably, the protagonist's fault that this thing happened. Make this mistake, isolate them from other characters. This isolation serves a twofold purpose in that it ostracizes the protagonist to show them the full scope of how they messed up, but it also gives them room to process their mistakes and their feelings on their own without any guidance or bias or advice coming in from other characters. They're trying to learn their lesson, and it's not really going to stick unless they are learning it by themselves, on their own, through their own processing and motivation. And then finally, have them actually learn that lesson. Make them realize how much their fatal flaw has overtaken them and affected their thoughts and behavior. This, as a general note, if we think back to that Act 2, the graphic with the overall narrative structure, this would be considered your second pinch point because this is where you're going to start building new tension and stakes heading into your climax. Much like the midpoint, try to keep this down to a single scene. Which we'll get into with the Mean Girls example a little bit, because there are some exceptions. The guiding questions here. What major event disrupts the status quo? What mistake did the protagonist make? How did they come to realize their fatal flaw? What makes them understand that it was their fault? And finally, what realization do they have that allows them to overcome it? How exactly did they mess up, and why did they do it? So this is what I mean about exceptions, because the mistake and consequences portion of Mean Girls is actually a couple of scenes, but the most important one here, and the one that really counts as the second pinch point, is the fight and the assembly, because this is where Katie finally gets the point. She understands what it is that Janice, Erin, and her teachers have been trying to tell her for a couple of scenes now. What major event disrupts the status quo? Regina realizes Katie has betrayed her and releases copies of the burn book to the whole school, exposing the rumors they've been spreading and causing a massive school-wide fight. Katie comes to recognize her fatal flaw because during the assembly, she has to hear all of the ways in which she and the other plastics, but really girl world as a whole, has hurt the girls around their school. And the realization she has, Katie has so far been able to coast on the belief that she's not really doing any harm that isn't deserved. But after Janice and Erin both tell her that she's becoming a real plastic that's just as bad as Regina, and after Regina herself calls her out for playing innocent and pretending she isn't responsible for her actions, she realizes how far she's fallen and how in denial she's been for the last few months. That brings us all the way to our Act 3 transition, our final essential scene. This is short and sweet, as it's all about tying up the last threads of the protagonist's character arc and preparing for the climax. We get another tonal shift here, as the protagonist is in the process of addressing their fatal flaw and developing a new perspective. This results in a more hopeful and determined tone following the absolute disaster of mistakes and consequences. This new perspective shifts the story's focus back to the external conflict, allowing you to start rebuilding your tension and stakes heading into the climax. That's basically the purpose of this scene in a nutshell, is to tie up the loose ends and focus on the climax. To do this, you can establish the protagonist's new perspective, showing how their approach to the conflict has changed, and hint at how their approach is more sustainable than what they were working with before based on their fatal flaw. It's time to reiterate the stakes and the primary external conflict to ensure that readers are focused on the bigger problem at hand. And finally, create a plan of action to ground readers before the next act. This also should be relatively short. The exact details of this plan don't really need to be ironed out until Act 3, and probably shouldn't be, because it's an important part of those essential scenes. But for now, it's a good time to just get readers on the page of like, what is our goal moving forward? What are we aiming to do? And the specifics of that can be established later. More of a general mission statement than anything too particular. So our final set of guiding questions: how does the protagonist's new perspective change their approach? What is it that they're doing differently? What makes this approach more likely to succeed? We know that this new approach is not going to be rooted in their fatal flaw anymore. So where is their motivation now coming from? And lastly, how do they begin making amends? How do they attempt to rebuild the bridges with the other characters, especially after this period of isolation? In our final Mean Girls scene, Katie sees how her fall from grace has caused the school's social ecosystem to fall apart, and realizes that feeling like an outsider doesn't mean her actions didn't have an impact. By acknowledging her impact, Katie realizes that every choice she makes has power. She's not exempt from the rules and should therefore be held accountable for her actions. Because she's now making decisions based off of a sense of empowerment instead of her naivete, she's more likely to act out of compassion and self-interest. Her original goal, which was fitting into her new school, she's more likely to succeed at now because she's trying sincerely to get along with people instead of acting separate from them as an outside observer or being fake like she was with the plastics. And to begin making amends, though she realizes she can't take everything back, Katie takes steps to what she calls suck out the poison by taking full blame for the burn book, despite knowing it'll turn people she cares about against her. In doing this, she also doesn't implicate Gretchen and Karen, although they were equally and probably more responsible for the things in the burn book, and this shows like a new commitment to actually holding herself accountable instead of trying to play like she was just going with the flow and doing what everyone else was doing. It shows that she's really learning her lesson and trying to put it into action. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So in conclusion, essential scenes define your story structure in Act 2. The new world establishes the external conflict and the protagonist's goal. The midpoint resolves the tension and the first half of the story. The new world twisted shifts focus to the protagonist's character arc. Mistakes and consequences forces the protagonist to confront their fatal flaw. And the Act 3 transition draws readers' attention back to the main plot. So thank you all again for listening on this big ramble and me talking a little bit too much about Mean Girls. If you would like to discuss any of these scenes in more detail, we're having a Q&A after this, but also please feel free to get in touch over email or reach out over social media. The QR code goes to my website where I have a handful of other resources if you would like to check those out.
Lee, thank you. That was actually very helpful. And like, I like that you used an example of a movie that I've seen, although it's been a number of years. And like reflecting on so many of the stories that I've watched, like I can see how this is a structure that is so common. Like so many like stories have those pinch points and those high points and those low points and the character isolation, like everything that you were talking about. And I know a concern a lot of writers have when they learn like these formulas or structures for the stories is that they make it formulaic and like predictable and not interesting. Do you think that's true? Like, how do you think about that?
I think it's very common because it's very complicated to get into like why people write sometimes formulaic stories depending on like what the publishing industry is looking for. I think that's a very big conversation that's happening in publishing as a whole. But I think that part of where that comes from is not always really understanding the purpose behind the essential scenes and just trying to fit in what you've seen in stories before without understanding why they're important. You know that like this plot point needs to be included, but not necessarily why, which can sometimes result in not like it it's not accurate to say copying because that's not what anyone is setting out to do. But I think it turns into something where if you don't understand your source and your material and your craft behind it, you don't quite have an understanding of what makes that moment work for your story, if that makes sense.
I think that does make sense. I know as a reader, like for example, some of the most meaningful scenes to read are that low point when the character is questioning everything, and like the analysis that the author provides at those low points can really be interesting and meaningful. And like where as a reader, I get a lot of like the interest. And it's not like the structure that makes it interesting, but it's the actual thoughts put into it. Like the structure is like the scaffolding.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the chat, I noticed and Andy Penner, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, that pointed out that some genres do have formulaic like structural conventions, things that readers are expecting to see, which I think is another thing that kind of pushes people into going a formulaic direction.
Mhm.
And I think that that kind of plays into what I was saying about there being like expectations from the publishing industry that a lot of people feel like beholden to in a big way. And I think that there are ways to follow conventions and subvert them at the same time, because I also like don't think there's anything wrong with a formulaic story. There are sometimes like there is a great comfort in seeking out a story and knowing that there are going to be beats that you're looking out for. Like if you're reading a romance that it advertises itself as like the, oh, there's only one bed trope, you're excited for that. Readers want to see that.
Yeah.
And to ignore that just to try to do something different, I think can be just as harmful. Really, it's just about being authentic to the story you're wanting to tell, whatever that is, and using these structures and these tools and these scenes to your advantage in order to accomplish that.
A quick question. I know a lot of writers use the term beats. Is that something you can explain?
Yeah, I think that there's I think that scenes, beats, and so on like are used pretty interchangeably. Basically, beats are just moments within the story, things that are expected to be seen at different points within the story. So like the pinch points, for example, are beats because those like are a good example because they are where I'm trying to, I've lost my words a little bit
Yeah.
and saying so many words at once. But it's a point where something occurs, an important moment in the story kicks off an escalating path of tension. So beats are essentially just like boiled down, like how can you describe this scene or sequence of scenes in like a single sentence? And that's typically like how you can define your beats.
They're like essential moments that move the plot along.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. We have a good question from Frank, who asks, in a multi-protagonist narrative, how can we ensure that each protagonist's development is distinct and equally engaging, especially when their storylines are interwoven?
That is a very good question. And I think it can be pretty complicated because I think that's where things like genre come into play. Because typically it just means your story is going to be a little bit longer. If you're working with multiple protagonists, you're kind of managing all of their character arcs, which means you're going to need multiple sort of mistakes and consequences scenes, and each of them is going to need a midpoint. And overall, you should still have like a singular plot structure to follow with all of those characters' individual stories sort of weaving in and out of it. So the story itself should still have the plot midpoint, but then there's juggling that with like the extra little midpoints that happen with the individual character arcs. Without knowing like more of the story and how it takes place, I think the short answer is sometimes the book is just a little bit longer. And sometimes these scenes are kind of blended together. If the stories are interwoven, you can often get like one point is a significant moment for both like two protagonists. And there are ways to sort of play around that depending on the relationships and dynamics that they have and whether or not they act as foils to one another can complicate that as well. So it's yeah, just kind of playing around with it really. I wish I had a better answer for that.
Yeah, I know that some of my favorite books are
Oh, me too,
multi-character
yeah.
protagonists and also very long. And that's okay. As a reader, I like long stories as long as I'm enjoying the entire story. That's fine. Oh, and so we got a question from Beth. Doesn't using formula make events too predictable and bored readers bored? And I mean, I have to say that I did not find Mean Girls boring, even though it was like very predictable. And like I think like the formulas like are can make for a more engaging story, really, when they're well executed.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it comes down to like at the end of the day, no story is really original anymore. Every single overall story structure, every possible interpretation of a plot has been done before. We've been telling stories for years.
Mhm.
And it's more about what you are doing with those plot points to make the story unique. I think a lot of people are really worried about predictability. And I think it's because of a conflation of predictability with boring. Predictability doesn't have to be boring. It can be interesting and it can be comforting, and it can be fun. You just have to be ready to play with it and ready to do fun and interesting things with the formula pieces that you're working with.
Yeah, I think the word play is really important in that. Like you don't have to just go through a formula. Like you watch a kid play and they're going to experiment and do things you expect and things you don't expect. And that's part of the joy of reading and writing.
Yeah. I was talking about this with a friend of mine recently that, it's so important that, as writers, we take our craft seriously and we dedicate ourselves to it. But at the end of the day, we are telling stories and we should be allowed to have a little bit of fun with it and play in those spaces and
Mhm.
play with these conventions and have a good time writing it and in telling a good story.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not much of a fiction writer, but I know if as a writer of poetry, if I'm not having fun, I just sort of sit there and stare at the blank page.
Yeah, it's art. It should be
Yeah,
fun, enjoyable.
at
It
least
can
some
be
of the
hard at
time.
times, but we do it because we love it.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee. Does the protagonist have a fatal flaw, have to have a fatal flaw, or can the tension result from something else?
Oh, that is a very good and complicated question. I personally am of the opinion that protagonists should have fatal flaws. Um, but there are other places that the tension is able to come from. I think a very good example of this is characters are allowed to have sort of neutral arcs where the things that are changing that are important about the story are changing around them. A very good example of this is Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games trilogy. The important thing that is changing around her is the world and what's going on with the rebellion and with the Capitol and the games themselves. All of that is where the main tension of the plot is coming from. But Katniss herself still has a fatal flaw that she needs to overcome, which is like her ability to trust other people to take care of her. And it's something that she works very steadily to overcome over the course of all of those books. It's not something that gets resolved in the first one. And so sometimes when you're looking at larger stories like that, whether you're looking at a trilogy or you're looking at a story where the plot is the main thing that's changing, it's the protagonist's fatal flaw more becomes about helping them understand those changes and process them in a healthier way. Ultimately, you're taking your character from a crisis point to a point of resolution, and having them undergo a change, even if it's not the crucial change that is taking place in the story.
Alyssa makes a good point in the chat. Sometimes that fatal flaw is just whatever they're going through at the time.
Absolutely.
It doesn't necessarily have to be fatal, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's a very dramatic way of putting it. But I think it's a good reminder of how important it is to pay attention to that flaw. Because it's very easy to like give your protagonist flaws that don't impact the story. They're allowed to have maybe they're picky eaters or whatever, or they're clumsy, or they have like a bit of a temper. Those can be flaws, but the fatal flaw is the thing that impacts their ability to make it through the course of the story.
Mhm. And it's satisfying to see a character figure out that one thing that isn't necessarily that complicated, but they figure it out and then their life gets better.
Exactly. I think like it helps if you think of it as a fatal flaw. Not resolving it is fatal to the progression of the story.
Okay, yeah, it's
The protagonists themselves.
fatal to the plot. That's
Exactly.
yeah, that's a good point. So we have a question from Natalie. Can you tell us the ideal approximate proportions of each act to the story? Is there a lot of leeway?
There is. This is going to depend very largely on the genre that you're working with. Because, for example, like fantasy is known to get like in the 100,000 words and up category. So it's going to be like the exact page count, chapter count breakdown is going to be a lot different than something like a romance, which is typically shorter, somewhere around 80 to 90,000 words and not really exceeding that. But there are things that break that all the time. I think a good way to think of it is usually about percentages, where Act Two should be fully the majority of your story. We're looking at like probably about 50 to 60%, I would say, with the opening and closing acts really just being bookends on that. They're both of those are comprised of scenes that are more dedicated to like setting up the story and making sure that you can get into Act Two and that readers have all of the information they need before the story begins. And then the closing bookend, which is just, hey, all of this stuff you learned in Act Two, let's bring it to a close in a way that doesn't feel too abrupt. So the majority of your time and page space should absolutely be spent on your second act.
We have a question from Alyssa. I'm curious how you would describe the scenes between these pivotal scenes.
I think non-essential is a good way of putting it. And it's basically just that these moments, they enrich your story and they are important. But like that's not to say that you don't need them, but they're not as essential to the structure and execution of your story. So like with the midpoint, the reason that is an essential scene is because it is an important turning point where you go from what the characters have been thinking and feeling and doing in the first half of the book to having something happen, some kind of plot twist, this upset that changes in the second half of the book. And that's not going to be quite as important as like some of these subplot scenes where maybe they're just learning a little bit of information that's going to be important later. That is obviously important to the story. Those are things like foreshadowing and things that you very much need, but your story can exist without them. You can find other places to put that information if push comes to shove and you really need to cut down on your word count. Don't cut the midpoint scene, you know, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. We have a question from Andrea. Do you start with defining each of these points and scenes, or you start with a story you think you want to tell and then see what's missing or in the wrong place?
That really comes down to your process. I typically really like to plot everything out. I like to plan everything in advance and know all of the different little crucial puzzle pieces that are going into stories. But so many of the writers I have worked with and have found success in writing just kind of wing it. They're pantsers. They like to play through it and then come back and handle those things during revision and editing. Personally, I think the best way to move forward is a blend of the two. So having some sort of idea of what those crucial moments are going to be so that if you find yourself getting a little bit lost in the weeds when you're drafting, you can kind of refer back to that and be like, okay, this is where I was going with this. How do I bring it back to this scene that I wanted to work in? And it helps when you're revising so you don't finish, you know, an entire, you're working with 112,000 words that you need to cut down to 80,000 and you have no outline in sight. It helps to kind of guide you in breaking that down. But there's definitely not a correct way to do it. Everybody's process is different and it just depends on what works for you when you're guiding these stories.
With the authors you work with, is it common to need to shorten the drafts that they're working on? Is that like a common issue?
Oh yes, yeah. I would say it's kind of equally common as like writers who go really hard into it and have a very elevated word count that they want to cut down into a more consumable piece, and also writers who like myself really only write the essential scenes and then go, okay, how do I turn this from 20,000 words into a whole book, you know?
Yeah. Do you have any advice for like fleshing out a story that does have all these essential scenes but just needs more?
I think it's good to look at I think it's helpful when you're looking at your essential scenes, kind of like we did with in the presentation with looking at the Act 2 points of Mean Girls, is you can kind of see like the sort of themes and where they're arising from, and find ways to incorporate more themes and subplots that will like allow you to explore that and play with those themes a little bit more. So if you have a character who is someone who isolates themselves when the going gets tough or whatever, there's a larger plot happening there where they have people that they are absolutely needing to work with in order to accomplish their goal, and they're kind of running away from their problems and not being willing to work with those people. A good way to flesh that out is to find a subplot that teaches them a very similar lesson. So like family issues, if they want to be close with their family, but their family has a lot of tension and conflict amongst them, find ways to have them interact in an awkward way with their sibling, have them get in fights with their parents over dinner, and learn how to resolve those issues in a lower stakes environment than when they're executing the larger goal in place. Little sneaky, I have that in the ebook that'll be coming out. Talk about that a bit more. So
Yeah, that should be coming out very soon. So that's something everybody can look forward to. And yeah, we'll keep an eye out on your email for the book, and you'll get lots more details about how to write these types of scenes. We have a question from Sarah. How do you avoid the main character's realizations from feeling cheesy?
I think just kind of giving them enough space to process the information. I think the thing that often makes those moments feel cheesy for me is when it just feels like a very coincidental realization that they've been plugging along and not really thinking about their flaws and their problems and how they're interacting with them until this absolutely crucial moment where, like, of course it all comes together in the end. And I think that if you lay the groundwork and show them putting this mentality into place, like a little bit ahead of time with smaller decisions, it'll pave the way for them to finally have that like, oh, moment where they realize what's been going on. And I think like another piece to that is like, don't be afraid of being a little bit cheesy. I know that you don't want to make things like a little bit too corny and everything, but I think that some like the nice thing about these characters being fictional is that their emotions are allowed to be a little bit more exaggerated as compared to a real person. And sometimes having like an exaggerated and slightly corny moment allows that lesson to sink in a little bit better to readers, and get the message of your story and this character arc across a bit more.
Mm. I think one of the interesting things is if you are writing the essential scenes and writing them in the right way, it sort of earns those moments and makes them not cheesy. And that's the way the formulaic writing actually makes it better and more believable, which is kind of ironic.
Yeah.
Does all of this information and this story structure apply to short stories as well?
I would say yes, but like very truncated. I really wish I could remember the video that I was watching, but I saw this excellent piece of advice on writing short stories, which is start late and end early. So you're really kind of reducing all of these moments and kind of getting rid of a lot of the buildup and getting rid of a lot of the resolution. So basically, I mean, your entire story kind of takes place just before the climax and just after it. And it's a little bit messy, but I think like the overall structure still works. You still want to have a little bit of build up, this moment of realization, and like the consequences of a decision that the character is making. And then rather than offering a full resolution to that with short stories, it's a very good place to just cut it off.
We have another question. I don't know if you've thought about this in terms of writing memoir, but I know that's something a lot of people ask. Like, do these types of storytelling techniques apply to memoir as well?
I think so, because like at the end of the day, we are still telling stories, regardless of whether these are like fantastical fictional tales or like stories from our own lives. I think a really good example of a memoir that uses this structure is Jeanette McCurdy's I'm Glad My Mom Died. wherein she's
Mhm.
kind of talking about like all of the trauma she endured as being a child actress and kind of coming up in that space under like an abusive producer. And they're still, it's a little bit more complicated because this is a living person. So having them learn a lesson and move through it isn't as big of an element of that. But I think that structure is still very much visible because you want readers to be empathizing with the character and following the story and following these moments of tension and high stakes
Yeah.
and being able to sit back and process what they're going through and or what the writer is going through and see how it could potentially apply to their own lives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I also think with memoir, like if you're thinking of writing a story about your life, how do you narrow it down?
Mhm.
And applying a structure like this really helps you like provide focus to your own story in a way that can really resonate.
Absolutely, yeah. Because it's very difficult to just kind of think about it in terms of, if you think of the midpoint as the middle of your life, that's a lot of work to
Mhm.
to build up and resolve. So I think finding what it is that you're writing this memoir about and identifying like what the crucial moments were that led to uh this part of your life happening and where it's going and how it's resolved and like fitting those moments into the essential scenes um, can kind of give you a good place to work with and a good bouncing off point so you don't have too much or too little information.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of the fatal flaw or like focusing on that one thing that you have to learn can
Mhm.
be like a really valuable turning point in a memoir, right? That's what so many memoirs are about, really, is like the author working through that one struggle.
Mhm.
Um, so we have a question. How would you feel about flashbacks that are placed into the beginning of Act Two to show the background of certain characters that will become prominent in the rest of the story?
Typically, I think those qualify as non-essential scenes because they're more there for building context. Uh, I think like another facet in determining whether a scene is essential or not is how much is it's advancing the story versus providing context for the story. And that context is still very important. It's still something that you want to include, but that's probably something that's better saved for those in between moments, so that readers have a chance to like process the story without it advancing the plot. It's not something that's happening in the current moment to the
Mhm.
character.
Do you have thoughts about alternative story structures? I know this is just like one way to write a story, but there's so many different ways to write a story. Do you have any thoughts about like alternative structures for stories?
Are you talking about like looking at a 5 act structure or like a
Yeah.
hero's journey kind of thing?
Yeah.
Uh, my my absolutely like hottest take on story writing is that story structures really are all the same, and it's just a matter of like how you break them down to have them make more sense to you. Um, where if you're looking at a 5 act structure, uh, it lines up so incredibly perfectly with a 3 act structure, but the midpoint just carries a lot more importance because that is sort of the crisis moment. And the climax comes more from like the character dealing with the fallout of those actions rather than the action itself. So everything sort of takes the same shape. And I think even looking at the hero's journey, it's typically like depicted as a circle of this character going around and entering the strange new world and crossing the threshold and coming back. But if you take that circle and you stretch it out into a single line, it is the 3 act structure, just like maneuvered around a little bit differently.
Yeah.
So I think it helps to look at other structures and look at alternative structures for guidance on like handling certain types of scenes, like tragedies, for example, work a lot better with the 5 act structure if you break it down that way. Um, but overall, like you're still generally including the same essential scenes. It's just about like the importance you're placing on them and what they're doing for your character.
Hmm. And it can always be helpful just to maybe even analyze, like pick a different structure and analyze your story through that structure just to see if you learn anything
Yeah,
about what you're
absolutely.
writing.
Yeah. I mean, and sometimes it helps, like if you're looking at, you know, the great similarities between a 3-act and a 5-act structure, like at the end of the day, your story could still fit on either one, but by looking at it and restructuring your essential scenes based on what the 5-act structure looks like, you may realize, oh, this midpoint is a lot more important than I was giving it credit for. You know,
Yeah.
I kind of just passed it off as just this passing moment that the protagonist is having to deal with, but this is a huge turning point for everyone. Maybe following the 5-act structure can give me a little more insight into how these characters are going to be reacting from now on.
Yeah. So we are just about out of time, but I'm wondering if you have any other last pieces of advice or wisdom for authors who are working through writing their stories.
Yeah. I my personal advice, I think, would just be to allow this to be a revising problem, really. I think that as writers, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on our first draft and making our first draft as strong and as complete as it can be. And I think it can be a huge barrier to progress when we're worried about achieving absolutely everything we need to in this specific scene and this specific moment. And I think like letting yourself sit back and just tell the story, and build your first draft out, and then worry about lining up these essential scenes in the future. If you're finding that it is a bar to you making progress and telling the story, come back to it later. You don't need these right now to tell a good story, and this is just something you can worry about when it comes time to get in the weeds and start doing the technical things. That can always be a later problem.
I think that's really great advice. And it reminds me of what you were saying earlier about how writing should be fun, primarily. If you're not having fun, then maybe step back and find a way to get there.
Exactly.
And there will be like points in the process that aren't fun, but you can always
Yeah.
go back and have fun as a writer. That's really what we should be focusing on with our writing, I think, is
Yeah.
the joy of writing.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be fun all the time, but
No.
I believe that the overall experience should be a good one. It shouldn't be stressful to do something that you like this.
All right. So thank you, Lee, very much for your time and your thoughts. I really appreciate it, and I have learned a lot today. For those who want to work with you or learn more about you, they can look you up, Lee Taylor Johnson. Um,
Yes, I saw in the chat that my QR code wasn't working. I'm so
oh,
sorry, but it's yeah, it my website, I'm Lee Taylor Johnson on everything. The big thing is Lee is spelled Ley. But any social media, my website, my email is all Lee Taylor Johnson, one word, you can find me.
yeah, and I think at the beginning of the chat, someone said that they're working with you right now and they really enjoy it.
Oh,
So
fantastic.
yeah.
Thank you. Whoever you were, I didn't see that, but I'm very happy to be working with you. I am sure.
So thank you as well to everyone who is here today. We really appreciate being able to serve you. If you have any questions for me, I always am open to your emails at support@authorspublish.com. I also want to thank everybody behind the scenes who makes these talks possible. Caitlin Jans, Emily Harstone, Escalikar, everyone at the Authors Publish team. Thank you. And thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a good one. Have a good weekend.